Okay, folks, I was just giving people a bit of time to collect whatever they needed to, but I'm going to get going. Thank you very much for taking the time. I thought that there might be a couple of people who'd be interested in what I've been doing over the summer, and just provides me with an opportunity to relive some of my experiences. Yeah, I want to begin with a quote that actually came from somebody that I sat next to on a plane many years ago, the first time I went to Africa. And he was a pilot who had been many times before. And he said, when the dust of Africa touches you, you can never wash it off. And I have to say that at the time I thought, well, that's a weird thing, but now I know exactly what he means. And literally this time I got into the dust and got covered in it for an extended period of time. What I thought I would do is to talk a little bit about the what, when, why, and with whom, and even where I went during August last year. So I actually walked about 450 kilometers across part of the Kalahari Desert through the whole month of August. Why? Well, fundamentally, it was to change my life. I realized that I live and breathe the University of Guelph 24/7, and I thought if I could go somewhere where I had absolutely no contact with the rest of the world, and in fact now my raison d'etre, or my whole being, would be focused on, am I going to be alive by the end of today? After about 4 weeks I might have truly forgotten something about the University of Guelph. That's possibly true. But fundamentally, I was walking towards what's called the Festival of the San. It's a time every year when the people of the San, who are spread right across southern Africa, walk to the middle of the Kalahari Desert. They dance together for an evening and a following morning, and then they walk home again, some of them walking 1,500 kilometers to do this. And apparently they've been doing this every year for as long as people know. And the other one, truthfully, is I've always wanted to do something totally crazy. I'm completely obsessed by Survivor. It's the only television program that I watch absolutely religiously. And I wanted to know if I would be as good or as bad as some of the people on Survivor, and have some of those real experiences. The with whom is I actually joined two people that I didn't know. A guy from Germany and a woman who I was told came from South Africa, but actually she originally came from Barcelona, and South America. Originally from Barcelona, and she'd been 10 years living in Lima, Peru. And she was actually coming because it had taken her 10 years to get divorced from the man that she married in Barcelona, and then went to follow to Lima, and this was her way of coping with what happened after the divorce. So we were really three quite dysfunctional people, and with a guide. So where is the Kalahari? I know some of you know, but it's probably a good idea to start there. Google map of Africa, and the bit of Africa that I'm interested in is this piece down here, the Kalahari Desert. Whilst I'm here, just notice this sort of funny little black splodge, which I'll come back to in a minute. But the Kalahari is actually mostly in Botswana, but it's also in the neighboring countries, Namibia, Angola, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. So it's quite an extensive area. It is not like most people think of the desert. Most people think of the desert, they have an image of the Sahara and rolling dunes. There's very little of the Kalahari that's like that, although there were some bits. Mostly it's sand and scrub and rocks. But it's not the kind of miles and miles of dunes that you expect when you think about the Sahara Desert. So just to give you a sense about getting there, began in Guelph and obviously traveled to Toronto, where I then caught a plane overnight to Frankfurt, and then caught a plane overnight down to Johannesburg, then took another plane up to Gaborone, which is the capital of Botswana. Another plane to Maun, which is just on the edge of the Okavango, and then an 8-hour car ride to Chikawe, through the Okavango to eventually reach my starting point. And all of that was about 20,500 kilometers before I'd even started to go on this journey. This is a detailed map of Botswana, and now you can see that little black splodge that I talked about at the top left. That is the Okavango River and the Okavango Delta. It is the only freshwater delta in the world. The rivers that make up eventually the Okavango flow into Botswana, and then the water evaporates in the desert. 90% of the waters evaporate. And what is absolutely remarkable, and I can talk about it if anybody's interested, is that the water remains fresh despite the fact that it evaporates, because they have things that, as far as I can see, are just like the kidney. In the Okavango, they actually extract the salt from the water to make sure that it stays fresh. And they're islands with even loops of Henley below them. They're quite remarkable. So South Africa is mostly towards the south and southeast, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Angola, and Namibia. And then, so you can see now, in fact, how big this is. And I started by flying into Gaborone, the capital, and then up to Maun, right on the edge of that Okavango delta. And then took a very laborious, long car ride across to Chikawe. And it's from Chikawe that I then began the journey. First of all, towards Hansi. First of all, actually on the Okavango, tributaries of the Okavango River itself, and then the real walking across the desert, total, as I say, of about 450 kilometers, including being on the water. So just to give you a sense of timing around this, it's 30 days that I was away, and from here on, whenever I show you pictures, there'll be a little clock at the top left to show you how far I've got through the journey. But those first few days were in travel, followed by 5 days actually on a Mokoro, a dugout canoe on the Okavango. Then 3 days in the swamp, worst possible days of the whole trip. And then 5 days in real scrubland, before going into a very rocky area, and then back into sort of dunes and scrub, and eventually in some more open scrub before spending 2 days at the festival. Then they'd suggested that we'd had a little bit of a leeway, so I took 2 days just to rest in a hut in Hansi before coming home at the end of the 30 days. So you'll see that clock appear with the pictures. And let me begin with the days on the Okavango. So we're in these dugout canoes. We each have a dugout canoe, and within a very short period of time, the guy from Germany says that he intends to be as san as possible, and so he takes off his clothes and rolls in the mud and says that's how he's going to be for the rest of the time. So I thought, well, why not? So in fact, we, all three of us, including Maria, took off our clothes and rolled in the mud as much as possible to keep the sun off us all the time. We each had a Mokoro. To begin with, the current was very fast, and so we made tremendous speed. But I have to say it was actually quite boring, because the weed is up to here on the side. You're sitting in a Mokoro, you can't really see anything unless something goes by, and things did go by, but most of the 8 hours of the day was just spent sitting, which was probably a really good start to the whole thing. But they do have these things who are actually the creatures that kill the most human beings in Africa, and you have to be really careful about them. We only saw 2 or 3 this time on the Delta, which was interesting. But we were sticking mostly to areas with big current, and they tend not to like to have big current. They tend to be in the sides, but they are nevertheless something you have to be really scared of. And then every now and then an elephant. This is a young male elephant, probably not long been kicked out of its herd and foraging actually within the delta itself. And then these ibis everywhere that you see. But you also see these things, some of them up to about 17 feet long, and just hanging around waiting for you to do something silly. And of course it was the problem of being in the swamp, which I'll come to in a minute, that alligators are really good at moving in the swamp, but humans are not, I discovered. So by the end of the 5 days, there is a Mokoro sitting there. We actually stopped, we just left our Mokoro. There's this whole sort of sense of people just leave stuff and trade it and move it, and it goes wherever it wants, and we just left our Mokoro exactly where it was. So each of us was in one of those. And you can see there's a stick here to punt the Mokoro with, and that helped as the water began to run out. Then it became much more active as we were trying to steer these things that are very heavy and cumbersome to try and move them through the narrows. And then in the end you end up getting out and just dragging your boat through the water. Quite hard slogging. But there'd been more water in the Okavango this year than they've had for a while, so the current was very swift and we made really good time. So when we got to about this place, Haniso, the guide, said, well, why don't we take a day off and just explore some of the islands that are around, which was great until in the distance on one of the islands we saw a few baboons. And he said, stand absolutely still. So we stood still. Gradually then, probably a troop of about 70 baboons appeared. And very soon afterwards, he pointed out the alpha male who was in the middle, and he kept sort of looking at us and then looking back at the troop and looking at us and looking back at the troop. And Haniso said, if he shows his teeth, we're going to run. And that's exactly what happened. He suddenly bared his teeth at us, and Haniso said, run. And we ran away from these things. This is not my picture. But I have to say, I've never been more terrified. I actually thought I wasn't going to make it. Because they're very fast. Haniso had a bow and arrow and a spear. And there would have been no way we could have defended ourselves. So we just ran, and I actually thought my lungs were going to give up. Now I regretted the fact that I was 30 years older than the other two who were on the trip. And that was very hard going. But eventually they chased us far enough away that they just gave up. I'm very wary of baboons, I have to say. So then we went into the swamp, which I don't really have a very good picture of. This looks rather picturesque. But this is where the Okavango is actually running out completely. So it's occasionally wet, it's occasionally marshy, it's often boggy, and every now and then you stand on something and go up to your knee in the bog. Haniso was very concerned because the crocodiles should be withdrawing as the river evaporates, but of course they're perfectly adapted to being in that part of the river, and anything else can't move with the speed that they can. So we did see some. It meant that he kept us on as high a ground as possible, and we zigzagged all day, backwards and forwards. We reckon we probably made 3 kilometers forward direction in 8 hours of walking. And because the water was now disgusting, we had to carry our own water. So we began with 18 litres of water each. 6 litres of water each. 18 litres of water each, because we had 6 litres a day to drink. But it was very, very heavy going. Before we went, I thought, well, I'm going to need to bulk up because I'm going to lose weight. So I actually went to see Alison Duncan here and talked to her, and in talking to a number of people, it was suggested that instead of putting on weight, I should actually starve myself before I go. 2 weeks before I go, starve myself, because it would put me into ketosis before going, so that when you are in ketosis, you become quite dysfunctional, you're confused, you have no energy, you don't want to do anything. And the advice was, do that before you leave, and then when you get there, you'll actually be on a rising plane of nutrition. you'll actually feel better, and you'll be most efficient at using anything you eat. Well, I followed the advice. I was actually serious. I had to hide from my wife that every time I stood up, I almost fell over because I was so dizzy in the 2 weeks before I went, because I really didn't eat anything. I was so grateful because 5 days in, which is when we were in the swamp, the other two went into ketosis. And so not only were they slogging through this awful, awful terrain, but they didn't want to, they were not certain why they were there, why would we be doing this? And I didn't have any of those feelings, so that was good. But we survived the swamp eventually. And ended up walking into this kind of scrubland with these acacia trees, stunted sort of bushes that you can see in the background, and clumps of grass. And this is mostly what the walking was like. So fairly soft sand to walk in, and not bad going. So I suppose the important thing to do is to confess that part of this sojourn was to say that we won't take any food or water with us. We had to find it all on the way. So the next question is, what did we eat? By the way, I should say I'm vegetarian, but I just made the decision I'm going to eat whatever comes my way, and whatever happens, but I'll just eat it. So on the river, it was easy. We caught tilapia. I had no idea how big tilapia were or how green they are. This doesn't actually give you any sense about how green these fish are. They are almost vivid green, and they can be up to this size, and they have lethal teeth. Unbelievable. But they're obviously nice to eat. When we were in the swamp, we ate catfish. And these are catfish that are fully adapted to being in that part of the world. When the water's there, they're swimming around, and when the water goes, they just bury themselves in the mud. But I discovered that catfish from there taste like the mud that they bury themselves in. They were disgusting. But nevertheless, they were good. We did eat these, puff adder. And python. Haniso allowed us to catch the python but wouldn't let us go near the puff adders. They are very, very aggressive and dangerous, and as you can see from this picture, fantastically camouflaged, and they just sit all over the place and can be really nasty. But he was brilliant at attracting their attention and then chopping their heads off. They taste like chicken. I know everybody says that, but they do. They genuinely taste like chicken. We also ate these things, veld plants. I couldn't find a picture of the size of ones that we ate, because most of the ones we ate were about this big, and they came in two types. Ones that were like a watermelon, but they were underground root things, and the only thing that you knew about them was there was a stick sticking up on the ground, and we learned to identify these sticks and also identify which ones had bigger veld plants under. So they were either like a watermelon or they were actually like a coconut. They had a flesh on the outside and a liquid in the middle, and the liquid was sweet. The flesh on the outside was disgusting, but it was, something to eat, so that was good. We also ate scorpion, and the nice thing about scorpion is we were there in the winter for them. So I was expecting temperatures to be up to 30 during the day and down to 5 at night. It was actually a heat wave, so it was 35 in the day and down to 10, maybe 12 at night. But the San have a brilliant system. When you build a fire, you put a ring of stones around, you make the fire, and then when you want to go to sleep, you roll the stones away from the fire, and you lie between the stones and the fire. And that's great because now both sides of you is warm. You don't have to keep turning over when one side of you gets cold. But the other thing is that the scorpions like heat. So they go for the stones, not for you. And I worried with this that I might be attracted to the scorpions. And then in the morning, Haniso just went round and gathered up breakfast from the stones. So it was a great way of getting food. We also ate crickets. I should say scorpion is actually quite nice. Crickets are horrible. They're just crunchy and there's no taste to them whatsoever. But Haniso ate them live, not for me. He also ate things like overgrown cinch bugs. They were about this long, they were white, and none of the three of us could ever manage to eat them. He would just dig them up and bite the heads off and eat them straight away, and none of us could do that. But we did eat termites. And termites are, at best, greasy. That's all I can say about them. They make a nasty sort of pulp in your mouth. But they were food. So to drink, two things. First of all, Haniso carried what's up on the top left, these sort of the skin bags. He had I've talked to several people and said it was like a Mary Poppins bag. He had a big bag himself, and in it he kept pulling out all kinds of things to use, including all of the water skins that we used to carry those 18 litres of water each. But we also relied on ostrich eggs. The San have an unbelievable trading system in ostrich eggs. They bury them. They eat them, they blow them and eat the insides. Then they fill them with water and bury them. And they bury them at certain points along tribal routes. And when you want to have something to drink, you dig up an ostrich egg, you use the water, you carry it on to the next place where there's water, you fill it up, and then you carry it on and bury it at the next place. And according to Haniso, there would probably be 20 or 30 eggs buried at each site that we would on, and so we had a constant supply through the ostrich eggs of water. I should say he had one aluminum bowl that we boiled all the water in all the time. But every now and then we came across a watering hole. This is just an example of one that would have a whole group of animals around it. And the first watering hole we came up against had a dead impala, absolutely perfect, nothing as far as we could see was wrong with it. It was just immaculate, but dead. And puzzle, why on earth wouldn't it have been savaged and ravaged by other predators? Until I realized it was by water, it was dead, it was in perfect condition, and it had a foamy mouth. So it was rabies, and everything else knew not to touch it, which I think is remarkable, including Haniso, but he wanted the skin. So I helped him skin it. The other two couldn't cope with the smell. And then he washed the pelt, he scraped it all off. It was an incredible process to watch. And then gradually folded it all up and put it back into his magic little bag for later on. But it was a really neat thing. So we had finished skinning it by about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Following morning, I would say 60% of it was gone because of insects. There were very few insects at all, but they suddenly appeared once the flesh was exposed, and the carcass was alive, absolutely alive with maggots, which of course he took a handful of and ate. And we moved on. It's really interesting. Having come back, I've been approached by a company here in Guelph who have bought the rights to the flies that actually make those particular larvae because they're a fantastic way of getting rid of animal carcass. And so they want to go into business doing this, and I've actually seen them doing it live in the field. But that's what one looks like when it's not rabid and lying on the ground. An impala, they're sort of like rabbits of South Africa. First time you see one, you think, oh, how wonderful, and then by the time you've seen the sort of 500th of them, you think, oh, not one again. But they are really, they're fantastic. I don't know whether, maybe I'll tell the tale now. We arrived once at a watering hole, and as we came over the hill, there was some impala drinking on the far side. So Haniso said, tomorrow morning I'll go down and actually see if I can get one, if I can shoot one. So I said, can I come? And he said, yeah, of course you can. And so before dawn he woke me up, and in that period when it's not actually light, but it's sort of grey. And he held out his hand and he said, "Put this on." And there was something black on his hand. So I said, "Man, what's that?" And he said, "Baboon shit." Because you needed to disguise your scent. And so he'd plastered himself in baboon shit. Well, I took one whiff of the baboon shit and decided that I couldn't do that. So he actually suggested some rocks that I climbed up, and I watched this man in 2014 go through a process that is thousands of years old as he crept down, hid himself in some bushes near the water. I actually saw him draw back his bow unbelievably slowly, so that you kept thinking, has he died in the process? And then let go, and nothing happened. And I thought, oh, he missed. And then one of the impala just went like that and fell over. It was incredible. Anyway, when I went down, he'd got it hung up. He'd filled up his bowl with impala blood and handed it to me with great glee on his face and said, "Drink this," which I couldn't do. But he drank a tremendous amount of blood, then he butchered it, and he put thin slices of meat out on the rocks to dry, and we had impala for some time. We had a huge breakfast of impala, but it was quite an incredible experience. And once again, a skin that had to all be cleaned off and everything, but just an amazing experience. So then we passed on and we walked through a rocky area. This is the best sort of picture that I can get of it. These rocky outcrops look as if they could be fairly smooth, but they're not. They're very sharp, and it was actually quite difficult walking. Kurt fell over during this time and gashed his leg, probably about that long, a gash in his leg. And Haniso suggested we should use a piece of sinew that he'd collected from the impala to sew it up with. But it was at that point that Kurt confessed he'd got a suture pack. So I actually sutured up his leg for him, but I'm thinking, oh, it's going to be really painful because we don't have any local anaesthetic. And that's when the Mary Poppins bag came in useful again, because Haniso produced some leaves from the bag and suggested that Kurt should chew on those, and within a minute he was off with the fairies. But that was actually very helpful, because we then persuaded Haniso that we should each have leaves every night from then on. So it passed the time quite a bit. But it was not easy. We had about 36 hours of a very surprised and too early for the season storm. And for anybody who's ever watched Survivor, where people are soaking wet, cold and miserable, and they start weeping about wanting to go home, you can imagine exactly how I was, because it was just horrible. And that's the moment when I really thought, what am I doing here? I just can't bear this. But there was no way out, so I had to put up with it. We took shelter in a sort of cave in one of these rocky outcrops that was definitely only recently inhabited by both baboons and leopard. So we had to build a fire at the front of the cave just in case they decided to come back. That meant the smoke came into the cave, and so I'm cold, I'm wet, I'm miserable, I'm lying on the floor and choking from the smoke. And it really was a miserable, miserable 36 hours spent like that. You can see that these rocky outcrops occur sort of at periods across the desert. And so you can actually move from place to place, because that's a good place to find snake and other forms of food. There were also things that looked like a cross between a rat and a rabbit. I'm not exactly sure what they were. I can't find anything about them. But he also snared those, and we ate those as well. I tried to think they were more like a rabbit than a rat. But and one of the days when but on in the caves there were all of these markings all over and there are in fact in the Cedillo Hills there is UNESCO World Heritage Site, where these are absolutely spectacular. But they were just everywhere as you're walking along. So one night we stopped on one of these rocky outcrops. It had just gone dark, and a lion fight emerged sort of just over here, not very far away. You couldn't see anything, but it was clearly two male lions fighting for supremacy. The noise was unbelievable. And Haniso did as he often did under those circumstances. He said, stay here by the fire, I'm going to find out what's going on. And you're not sure whether that's a good thing or not when he's gone. But after a while he came back and explained, yes, it was a fight for supremacy. And it was a pride of 3 lionesses and a male lion and a challenger. And we should just stay close to the fire. Well, it went on and on and on, and eventually I sort of drifted off into sleep, only to be woken up by Haniso pointing out the lionesses were caching their cubs. And I don't know if you know, but when a challenger goes to a pride of lions and is successful, he then goes round and kills all the cubs so that he can be the father of any future cubs that are born. The problem was the male lions are fighting over here. The lionesses decided to hide their cubs over here. And so we spent the rest of the night as the fight was going on thinking, when the challenger wins, we're right in the way to get to the cubs, which wasn't very comfortable until it was probably about 2 o'clock in the morning. It all stopped. Absolutely total silence. And now none of us are asleep. We're all peering out into the darkness because we're expecting the guy to come. And Haniso says, stay here and I'll go and see what's gone on. Anyway, he came back and said he thought the challenger had lost. And indeed, in that grey light in the morning, we watched the male lion limping very badly and the 3 lionesses come by, pick up their cubs and walk off. And we don't actually know what happened to the challenger. So then we walked again through progressively more and more sand, this very red sand. At one point we found a whole nest of ostrich eggs, and Haniso insisted that he should get the egg because the ostriches are very, very territorial, and he got one egg that produced more scrambled egg than you could imagine for breakfast. We actually didn't finish it all. But then, in the same way as before, we blew the egg, dried it, and then filled it up next time. And this was something that was absolutely remarkable. Came over this hill to see this herd of ibex. I'd only ever seen them as 1s or 2s before. I'd never seen a whole herd of them like that, just sort of walking away into the distance. Some spectacular moments to remember. Just on the edge of the sort of really sandy part, one lunchtime, a group of San just walked into the camp because we were on nomadic routes going to the Festival of the San. We had expected to see quite a number of groups. We actually only saw 2 in the end. But this group were great. There's an ostrich egg they're carrying in a container there. And they came, they sat with us during lunchtime, then they walked on with us in the afternoon, and when we got to the evening, they put down their stuff, and in half an hour I'd got more food than we'd seen the whole time we were there. It was incredible. See, they sat down, ate with us, and then the most magical thing of all, the moment we'd finished eating, under the moonlight, they just got up and started to sing and dance to each other. Just absolutely mind-blowing as they're dancing around the fire. You'll see that on their legs they have seed pods that they actually use to stamp with to make the noise like maracas, although they make a whole variety of noises depending upon how they stamp and how hard they stamp on the ground. And those seed pods, it turns out, are a way of identifying their history and their connections with people, because as soon as the group walked into the camp, Haniso sat down and out of the Mary Poppins bag came a whole load of seed pods that he then very ritually exchanged with the visitors. And then they started to talk about, well, this seed pod comes from here and I met these people here. and a fascinating way of them actually communicating about what their experiences and the people that they've met. This group, there were 7 people in the group that we had, and then eventually we ended up walking through real dunes. That was very heavy going, but by now we were really used to it. And towards the end, unfortunately the picture doesn't really show it, but another group of San walked into the camp. They're known as the Red People. They come from Namibia. Oh, I should have said the first lot came from Angola. So they were probably doing 1,500 kilometers in total for their walk. These people came from Namibia, and they're known as the Red People because they cover themselves in red mud. And they literally are, I mean, it doesn't really show it at all, but they sort of glow red. But they must carry the mud with them to touch up their makeup during the time they're there, because they're just red all over. They were less communicative. They walked in, they sort of did the seed pod exchange and then walked off again. And then almost towards the end, we're sitting having lunch one day, and there's this funny yipping sound, and when we go over the hill, there was a massive pack of wild dogs who'd obviously eaten. You can see they've actually been in the mud if you look at their feet for some of them, but they were so bloated, it was unbelievable. They are in fact the most successful hunters in Africa, and I just think they're absolutely fabulous. But as we're watching them, we suddenly realized there's another noise, and we found these. And they were absolutely, they'd obviously been cached during the time that they'd done the kill, and they were all stacked on top of one another. They were really, really cute, and all I wanted to do was to go over and talk to them, but of course that would have been a disaster. But they were really, really lovely. Anyway, and then eventually we ended up arriving at the Festival of the San. Somehow they knew we were coming. Presumably it's the groups that had walked through, but everybody wanted to touch these white nutcases who were covered in mud and were trying to be like San. I mean, they from the children to the adults to the very, very senior members, they all came up, and all they wanted to do was to just touch you and then laugh at you, because of course you don't really look San at all. And now you can see the seed pods. This is actually this is the public part of the Festival of the San, and quite fascinating because all the different sects will dance, and often technically the same dance, but you can see variations depending upon where they come from and the value that they place on things. There are 2 parts to the Festival of the San. The piece on the Friday afternoon and into the evening is public, and then they withdraw, and if you've been on the nomadic routes, you can go into the private part. Before then there's another public part the following day. I'd been to the public one before, but this time I was privileged to go into the private part. However, I have to say it was a classic demonstration of it's not the destination, it's the journey that's important, because this was a complete anticlimax. All I wanted to be was back out in the desert. And yes, it was incredible. It was amazing to be in the presence of something that's been going on for at least 3,000 years, but I just wanted to be back in the desert. And so the last 2 days, we each had a hut like this that we stayed in, and two very strange things happened. For those of you that know me, you will understand when I say it was strange. I found myself just sitting outside the hut doing absolutely nothing on both days. I did nothing but look at the distance, and then all of a sudden I go, oh, it must be, lunchtime, or oh, it must be time for supper. I honestly don't know what happened, but the other 2 had the same thing happen to them, and none of us slept in the hut. We all decided that it was actually better to sleep on the sand outside, as we'd been sleeping the whole time. It was very, very weird. But at the end of that, you can see from the clock that we're almost at the end. We were then driven back to Gaborone. For those of you who know it, I went to the News Cafe hotel, and I had 4 baths, and the water was still black. In fact, when I got home, probably for 3 weeks, I was having to change the towel that I was using every time I showered or bathed because I was just so encased with mud. So lots of people have asked me how much did it cost. It actually cost $2,500, which was given to the commune, to Shikawe. The guide got nothing, but it's given to the commune. They decide what they're going to do with it, and they do community-based projects in the commune. And that's included putting running water in, installing solar panels, and actually building a primary school to date. So it was, you felt as if you were actually doing something. And the reason the guide doesn't get any money is that they're going to walk anyway. And so the head of the village just finds somebody who's prepared to put up with a load of foreigners walking with him. And they also have to agree, which is very difficult for nomads, that you are going to walk from A to B, because they tend to walk from A to A.5 and then decide they'll go to Z. So you need to be somebody who's willing not only to put up with foreigners, but actually be willing to agree you're going to go to a certain place. What changed in me is that I did, at least for the time that I was away, forget the University of Guelph. I did not have my cell phone with me, and I stopped looking at my email every 2 minutes, every 24 hours. It hasn't quite worked out, but it stayed that way. And I did, when I first came back, I had real trouble with walls. I would be in a room and I needed to get outside. And in fact, Catherine and I, this was the exchange, we went to Europe almost immediately afterwards because I promised that I would go on holiday with her if I was still alive. And we're in London by the side of the Thames, and I actually, for a moment, thought, I'm going to jump in the water. I can't cope with all of these people. And I've never ever felt like that before. I just wanted space. But I suppose the $64,000 question is, would I do it again? I would go in a heartbeat. I would go in a heartbeat to do this, and I would absolutely go for 6 months next time. It was the most phenomenal thing that I've ever done. Partly because the people I was with were so fabulous. They were equally nuts. They were equally keen to learn as much as possible. And I know that if by some chance I was dropped alone in the Kalahari tomorrow, I know how to make fire. I know what are the 3 types of wood I need to be able to do that. I know how to get water, and I know what to eat, and I know I could survive. So it did make a huge difference. Anyway, thank you for letting me relive the journey. And I'd be very happy to answer questions if people want to, or ask them. Kate.
Thank you, Alastair. No, we all want to go.
I'd suggest
so I'm assuming that your guide spoke English, is that?
He did. He spoke 4 languages, actually. He spoke English, Setswana, Swahili, and his own native language. He didn't like speaking Setswana because it's the official language that they should speak. He spoke Swahili because it was a good way to communicate with everybody, all of the other tribes and groups. And then he spoke English because he was forced to learn English. And he was actually quite proficient at English, which was great because he could explain things like, how do you tell the time? How do you catch things? How do you kill things?
And did the people that you encountered, were
they didn't speak very much English, so it was mostly done through Hanisa. From being in Botswana before, I had come into contact with the people in Shikawe, And I don't know how many years ago now, I actually organized a student trip to the northwest of Botswana and worked with the people in the village, and we spent some time on Makoro. And I have done a trip with them before of 2 days, and out of the village and back to the village, so I sort of knew what I was getting into, and I'm through a contact that I have. They were driving up to Chicago and they made the arrangements.
So you actually walked,
I walked.
like what we see in the movies.
I
You
walked.
were naked. And no shoes.
No, actually, I took 3 pairs of shoes. I took a pair of Merrells, Tevas, those things, and they were fantastic in the swamp because you didn't know what you were standing on, and there were some quite sharp reeds and things in there. But when we got to the stony area, they were slashed within about 4 hours of being in the stony area. I couldn't believe how quickly. So then I had an old pair of trainers that I wore that also gave up the ghost fairly quickly. And then I have a pair of Birkenstocks that I've had for years that actually survived the whole thing, and they really don't look any worse than when I started. So I'm thinking of writing to Birkenstock and say, this was an amazing thing. But a lot of the time, when I could, I walked barefoot.
Just to the climate?
Yeah, I mean, it was, as I say, it wasn't as cold as I thought it was going to be. There were some nights when it was cold, and just when I told you about the rain, everything got wet, including my sleeping bag. So I put it out on a bush, which of course was an acacia bush, and then the following morning, I didn't think, I pulled it off the bush, and it just immediately shredded into pieces. Then the cold hit. So I basically ripped my sleeping bag from one end to the other, and I wrapped it around me and sort of laid on the crack in it to try and keep it together. But I'm not a very still sleeper, so that didn't really work very well. Yep.
Did you have to filter or treat your water in any way?
No, it didn't filter it. The only treatment was to boil it. So we boiled it all the time. And even when we were on the Okavango, when I think it probably would have been okay to drink because it was moving quickly, we still boiled it. And I'm glad we did, because giardia was probably the thing that I would most likely to get.
Are you vegetarian again when you
I am.
You can't have this exotic food?
I am. I'm now. It was very nice to come back and continue to be vegetarian, but I'm surprised I didn't have any side effects from sort of massive change in diet. So it was. I did eat a lot of grass so that I had fiber, but that was it. No. No, I've had to promise not to do that.
Can you tell us a little about the sand? So
Yes.
This appears to be a group of people who are now dispersed across multiple countries.
Yes.
Can you describe it?
Yes. So the San is a collective term for the people of this part of the world. They are not one tribe, not one unit, not one sect. They're actually physically quite different. Some are taller. The red people, for example, were quite a bit smaller than the other group that we saw. But they share interesting customs. So the weaponry all looked the same that they were carrying. They have the seed pods that they exchange. They have a bond with each other that is something that seems to transcend the fact that they would also identify themselves as being part of a particular group. Some of them are very distinct, the red people, for example, that everybody else knows about. Some of them are less so and are much more, that they communicate more. They all speak different languages. They're really quite incredible. So, Mike.
I guess I was wondering, you had the context of, University of Guelph, this lifestyle, and you wanted to put that down.
Mm-hmm.
You were saying. San have never had
No.
this contact.
No.
And I was just wondering, like, did you ever have dialogue with them about the differences, or were they curious, or were
They weren't at all curious. I mean, we spent all that time with Haniso, and he really didn't ask anything about us. I mean, we asked questions of each other, and he must have listened to that, but he didn't ask anything. He just assumed that, you know, we would be inept, incapable white people who would really not be able to function in this place. And he was very patient at explaining and working with us, but he never asked us anything about, you know, the lifestyle we had.
And did you get a sense at all of anything about their personal struggles? You know, like we have our personal struggles with this concept.
No, more it was, you know, why would you not want to be here all the time? I mean, that was the, you know, he was really quite, I don't know whether I would say moved, but he was surprised when we all rolled in the mud. And it was a, you know, are you kidding me kind of look on his face. But then he actually, I think he was proud of us, because when we got to the end, he was the one who was sort of talking to them and obviously joking about some of the things that we'd done, but there seemed to be a kind of pride that we'd actually wanted to be as native as possible. So it was very cool, but he really, it was fascinating. He, you know, why would you want to do anything else but this? And so I have obviously experienced some of the challenges that the San have faced, as all people who've been colonized have faced, and particularly those that have been rounded up and put in reserves. But I don't know whether it was being out and being free and being back to who they are. None of that seemed to appear. You know, that was part of the fabulousness of it. Well, thanks, folks. If anybody else wants to come and ask anything, please feel free. And thank you for taking the time.